If you've ever wondered whether fate has a way of bringing people back together, no matter how far apart life pulls them, stay with me until the very end of this one, because what happens in this mansion will remind you that some bonds can survive 20 years of silence. And if stories like this move you, do me a favor right now. Hit like and subscribe, because we have so many more of these waiting for you. Richard Ashford had everything a man could want, at least by the world's measure. A real estate empire spanning 4 states, a mansion with 22 rooms he rarely used, a name that opened doors in rooms most people would never even see the inside of. But for 20 years, Richard had been missing the only thing that ever truly mattered to him, his daughter, Emma. The story of how he lost her was one Richard had never told anyone, not his business partners, not his closest friends, not even the reporters who occasionally tried to dig into his mysteriously private past. It went back to a bitter, chaotic divorce when Emma was only 3 years old. Richard had been buried in work, building the foundation of the empire that would eventually make him wealthy beyond imagination, and in the chaos of the separation, his ex-wife had taken Emma and vanished, moving across the country under her maiden name, cutting off every possible thread that could have led Richard back to his daughter. By the time Richard had the resources and the desperation to search seriously, the trail had gone cold. His ex-wife had passed away years later in an accident, and with her, the last living link to Emma's whereabouts disappeared as well. Richard hired investigators. He spent millions over the following 2 decades trying to find any trace of his daughter. Every lead ended in disappointment. Eventually, buried under grief he refused to let anyone see, Richard stopped searching out loud, though the ache never once left him. Emma Reyes, she'd grown up under her mother's maiden name, unaware that the man she'd occasionally heard mentioned in old family arguments was actually a self-made millionaire, searching for her every single year, had lived a life defined by hard work and quiet resilience. Her mother passed when Emma was just 16, leaving her to bounce between distant relatives who offered a roof but little warmth. By the time Emma turned 20, she was entirely on her own, working double shifts at diners, then eventually finding steadier, if physically demanding, work with a private household staffing agency that placed cleaners in wealthy homes across the city. She was smart, smarter than the life she'd been handed, but circumstance had never given her the stotch chance to prove it beyond the walls of other people's houses. 6 months ago, the agency had placed her at the Ashford estate, one of the largest private residences in the region, owned by a reclusive but famously private businessman she'd only ever glimpsed from a distance, usually rushing past in an expensive suit, too busy or too distracted to notice the woman quietly cleaning his floors. Emma didn't mind the anonymity, honestly. In a strange way, she preferred it. Being invisible in wealthy homes meant being left alone, and being left alone meant nobody asking questions about a childhood she'd rather not discuss. She kept to herself, worked hard, sent money to help the younger cousin still living with relatives back home, and told herself that this was simply what her life was, steady, quiet, unremarkable, but hers. Richard's household staff had always been managed by his estate director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane, who handled every hire without bothering Richard with the details of who cleaned which room on which day. Richard, buried in board meetings and international deals, rarely crossed paths with the cleaning staff at all. He left before sunrise most mornings and returned well after dark, moving through his own mansion like a guest passing through a hotel he happened to own. Until the morning, everything changed. It started as an unremarkable Tuesday. Richard had a rare late start to his schedule. A canceled overseas call gave him an extra hour before his first meeting, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he walked down his own grand staircase slowly, phone in hand, distracted by an email chain about a stalled property deal. He barely registered the quiet sounds of cleaning coming from the foyer below. Diane's staff worked early, and Richard had long since tuned out the background presence of people maintaining the enormous house around him. But something made him look up from his phone. Maybe it was the tilt of a stranger's head. Maybe it was simply fate finally deciding enough time had passed. Whatever it was, Richard's eyes lifted from the screen and landed on a young woman kneeling near the base of the staircase, polishing the marble floor, her dark curly hair pulled back in a low bun, her face turned slightly toward the morning light streaming through the windows. Richard froze. It wasn't recognition in the way people usually mean it. He hadn't seen a photograph of adult Emma in over 15 years. And the investigator's last confirmed image was of a child, not a young woman. But something about the shape of her jaw, the particular tilt of her eyebrows, the exact shade of disrise, brown in her eyes when she glanced up curiously at the man who had suddenly stopped moving on the Deary. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was like watching his ex-wife's face and his own mother's maze expressions blended into someone entirely new, someone eerily, unmistakably familiar, "Sir, are you all right?" Emma asked, standing slowly, uncertain why the homeowner was staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Richard couldn't speak for a long moment. His hand gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles went white. Memories he had buried for 20 years surged forward all at once. A toddler, laughter in a sunlit garden, a small hand wrapped around his finger, a birthday he'd missed because of a business trip he could never take back, the years of silence that followed the divorce. He stared at the small gold pendant hanging from Emma's neck, barely visible above her collar, and his breath caught entirely. He recognized that pendant. He had given it to his ex-wife the week Emma was born, and it had disappeared along with them both. "Where did you get that necklace?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice unsteady in a way none of his employees had ever heard before. Emma's hand instinctively went to the pendant, confusion flickering across her face. "It was my mother's," she said slowly. "She passed away when I was 16. It's the only thing of hers I have left." Richard descended the remaining stairs on unsteady legs, each step feeling heavier than the last. "What was your mother's name?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer before she spoke it. "Laura," Emma said. "Laura Reyes." Well, Reyes was actually her maiden name. She never really talked about her life before that. The name hit Richard like a wave. Laura had been his ex-wife's real first name, buried under the more formal name she'd used during their marriage. Richard's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the newel post at the bottom of the staircase, his composure, the same composure that had carried him through hostile takeovers and financial collapses, completely abandoning him for the first time in decades. "Emma," he said quietly, testing the name on his tongue like it was something fragile. Her eyes widened. "How do you know my name?" What followed was one of the most difficult, emotionally overwhelming conversations of Richard's life. He asked Diane to clear the foyer, then, sitting Emma down in the mansion's private study, he told her everything: the divorce, the disappearance, the 2 decades of searching, the investigators, the dead ends, the grief he had carried silently through every business, triumph that meant nothing without her. He showed her the old photograph he kept locked in his desk drawer, the one of himself holding a laughing toddler in a garden, a photograph Emma stared at for a long, silent moment before recognizing, with a jolt, the shape of her own eyes staring back at her from a face nearly identical to her own. Emma didn't cry right away. She sat in stunned, disbelieving silence, turning the impossible pieces over in her mind. The mother who never spoke of her past, the vague, bitter comments about him she'd overheard as a child and never understood, the sudden moves across the country that her mother always brushed off as fresh starts. Slowly, painfully, the fragments of her fractured childhood began arranging themselves into a picture that finally made sense. "You're really him," she whispered eventually. "The father I thought didn't want us. I never stopped looking for you," Richard said, his voice breaking entirely for the first test. Time in front of another human being in longer than he could remember. Not for one single year. The following weeks were not easy. Trust, once broken by 20 years of absence, doesn't rebuild in a single emotional conversation, no matter how sincere. Emma struggled with anger she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Anger at a father she'd never known. Anger at a mother who had hidden the truth. Anger at a life of hardship that suddenly felt unnecessary in the shadow of the wealth she'd unknowingly been scrubbing floors inside of for 6 months. Richard, for his part, struggled with guilt so heavy it nearly crushed him. Guilt over years of searching that somehow still weren't enough. Guilt over a life of comfort he'd built while his daughter grew up cleaning other people's houses to survive. But slowly, through careful, patient effort, something began to heal. Richard didn't try to buy Emma's forgiveness with money or possessions. He understood, with a clarity his wealth had never given him before, that what Emma needed wasn't a mansion or a trust fund. She needed time. She needed honesty. She needed a father willing to show up, consistently, without conditions, the way he never had the chance to 20 years earlier. He started small, dinner once a week, just the two of them, where Richard listened more than he spoke, slowly learning who his daughter had become without him, her sharp wit, her quiet determination, her surprising talent for sketching that she'd never had the resources to properly pursue. He learned about the cousin she still supported financially, and quietly, without fanfare or expectation of thanks, made sure that cousin's education was covered for as long as it was needed. He never once demanded Emma quit her job or move into the mansion, respecting the independence she had built for herself out of necessity, until the day she chose, entirely on her own terms, to accept his invitation to actually live in the home she had once cleaned as a stranger. 6 months after that frozen moment on the staircase, Emma stood in the same foyer, no longer in a gray cleaning uniform but in her own clothes, home, not as an employee but as herself, looking at the family portrait that had once leaned against the wall for cleaning, now properly restored and hung above the fireplace. Richard stood beside her, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the empty space beside him in every family photograph finally had someone standing in it. "I used to dust this frame every single day," Emma said quietly, staring at the portrait of a much younger Richard holding a laughing toddler. "I had no idea I was looking at myself." Richard put a careful, uncertain hand on her shoulder, still learning the small physical gestures of a father he'd never gotten the chance to become. "Some things," he said softly, "take 20 years to find their way back to where they belong, but they find their way eventually, if you never stop looking." Emma leaned, just slightly, into her father's side. A small gesture, but one that carried the weight of everything 20 lost years had taken from them both. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled through the mansion's tall windows, catching the restored portrait in warm golden light, illuminating a family finally, imperfectly, beautifully whole again. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine, Richard Ashford finally had the one thing his money had never been able to buy back on its own: his daughter home for good.